Clint Eastwood has worked with some of the biggest stars in Hollywood, but not all of them got a second chance. Over the years, he quietly decided there were certain actors he would never work with again. The reasons range from shocking betrayals to surprisingly small moments that changed everything. The question is, what made Clint Eastwood so quick to close the door on certain people while remaining fiercely loyal to others? Because that part of his personality didn't appear overnight. To understand any of it, you have to go back. Not to the poncho, not to the cigar, not to the squint that a generation of men practiced in their bathroom mirrors. You have to go back before all of that, to a family in a car, driving up and down the coast of California in the middle of the Great Depression, looking for work. He was born in San Francisco on the last day of May in 1930, 7 months after the market fell apart and took the country with it. Clint Eastwood Jr., 11 pounds and 6 ounces, which in 1930 was a startling amount of baby, and the nurses at St. Francis Memorial gave him a nickname that would have suited any of the men he played later. They called him Samson. His father sold things, then he sold other things. For a while, he worked as a detective in San Francisco, and later he would end up an executive at a paper company. But that was much later, after the worst of it. In the 1930s, he was a man who followed jobs, and the family followed him. A sister arrived in 1934. They moved and they moved, and they moved again. Now, there's a version of this story that Eastwood himself has let stand over the years, and it's the version you'd expect. Depression kid, hard times bare cupboards, learned to be tough because nobody was coming to help. It isn't quite true, and the truth is more interesting. By about 1940, the family had landed in Piedmont, which is not a hardscrabble town. Piedmont is a wealthy little pocket sitting inside Oakland like a jewel in a setting, and the Eastwoods lived there comfortably. There was a swimming pool. There was a country club membership. His mother and father each had a car, which in that decade was the kind of detail neighbors noticed. His mother eventually took a clerical job at IBM. Whatever the family went through in the early years, by the time young Clinton was 10, they had come out the other side, into something that looked a great deal like the good life. So the wound wasn't hunger. It was something quieter and, in the long run, more useful. It was motion. All those moves, all those new schools, all those first days walking into a classroom where everyone already knew everyone. A child learns something from that, and it isn't self-pity. He learns that people are temporary. He learns that the room you're standing in is not your room, and the kids in it are not your kids, and that the thing to do is keep your face still, say little, and wait to see who's worth the trouble. He learns not to need. Imagine it if you didn't live it. A boy of 7 or 8 in the back of a car, with everything the family owns packed around him, watching a town he had almost figured out slide backward through the window. He does the sum in his head the way children do, without words for it. He has just spent a year learning who to sit with at lunch, and which teacher can be handled and which one can't, and where the good hill is. And now all of that is worth nothing. And in 3 days, he'll be standing in a doorway while 25 strangers look up at the new kid. Do that twice and you cry about it. Do that 6 times and you stop unpacking the box. Watch him at 90 on a movie set, and you are watching a boy who changed schools too many times. Watch him decline to explain himself, and you are watching that same boy at the back of a classroom, deciding it isn't worth it. School did not love him, and he did not love it back. He was held back at Piedmont Junior High, and did his time in summer school. And by high school, the trouble had a certain style to it. He was asked to leave Piedmont High after a run of incidents. That included writing something obscene on the football scoreboard, where the whole town could read it, and burning an effigy on the school grounds. These are not the crimes of a hard case. They are the crimes of a bored, clever kid who has already figured out that the institution has no real claim on him. He landed at Oakland Technical High School, and this is where the shape of the adult man starts to show through the boy like a bone under skin. He took auto mechanics. He took aircraft maintenance. He pulled engines apart and put them back together, which is a thing you do alone, at your own pace with your hands. And either it runs at the end or it doesn't. There is no committee. There is no discussion. He played the piano, and not casually. He sat at it for hours, teaching himself, chasing something in the chords that he couldn't have explained to anybody. Jazz got into him early and never left. 50 years later, he would score his own films, and the way he shoots them, the way he lets a scene find its own tempo, and then stops before it gets tidy, is the thinking of a man who learned time signatures before he learned dialogue. And the sports, look at what he chose. Tennis, golf, swimming. Not football, not baseball. not the games where 11 boys have to agree on something. He picked the sports where you stand alone, and the result is entirely yours. And he stayed with those his whole life. A drama teacher or two tried to get him into the school plays, and he wasn't interested. His interests, by his own cheerful admission decades later, ran to fast cars and easy women, roughly in that order. He got out of Oakland Tech in early 1949. Accounts differ a little on whether he finished clean or slid out sideways, which is fitting for him. Then came a stretch of work that would sound like poverty in a movie, and just sounded like Tuesday to him. He was a lifeguard, he carried papers, he clerked in a grocery, he fought forest fires, he caddied. Up in Springfield, Oregon, he worked at a pulp mill running log broncs, which meant standing on wet timber and moving things heavier than himself, all day in the rain. None of it was tragic, all of it was instructive. He was learning the only lesson that ever really took with him. And it wasn't about acting, it was about waste. Every one of those jobs was a job where a man is paid for a block of hours, and the hours either produce something or they don't. You do not stand around at a pulp mill discussing your motivation. You do not workshop the log. He was absorbing in his bones a way of thinking about time that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the film industry, and would also, 60 years later, quietly end a great many professional relationships without a single raised voice. Because that's the thing about the list. Most of the names on it are not there because Clint Eastwood hated somebody. They're there because somebody cost him time. But not all of them. That's the trouble. That's what makes the list worth reading. Because scattered among the people who were simply too slow are 3 or 4 names that have nothing to do with the clock at all. And those are the ones he has never explained. And one of them ended in a courtroom, and one of them ended in a car in Paris with the doors locked. He didn't know any of that yet, of course. In the spring of 1951, he was 20 years old, and the United States Army sent him a letter, and everything that would eventually make him unbearable to work with and unforgettable to watch was about to be handed to him in one cold night in the Pacific Ocean. The Army took him in March of 1951 and sent him to Fort Ord on the Monterey coast, and if you were designing a war to suit Clint Eastwood, you could not have done better than the one he got. Korea was on. Men his age were going and not coming back. He went 80 miles down the road from where he was born and taught soldiers how to swim. He also ran the projector for training films, which meant that a 21-year-old who had shown no interest whatsoever in the theater spent a good part of his service sitting in a dark room watching images move across a screen over and over, learning without meaning to what a cut looks like and how long an audience will sit still. He worked a loading dock on the side for extra money. It was the softest war a man could have. And then, on the last day of September in 1951, the Pacific Ocean nearly took him anyway. He had been up in Seattle visiting a girl. To get back to base, he hitched a ride the way servicemen did in those days, catching a lift in a Navy plane going his direction, a Douglas dive bomber flown by a pilot he had never met. Somewhere over the water, the aircraft began coming apart in small ways that added up. The rear door wouldn't hold, the oxygen failed, the navigation gear failed, the intercom failed, which meant that Eastwood, sitting behind the pilot, could not talk to the only other person alive on the airplane. Then the fuel ran out. They put it down in the ocean off Point Reyes, north of San Francisco, in the dark. Both men got clear. There was a raft, and then there wasn't much of a raft. And then there were 2 men in cold black water with the shore somewhere out there, roughly 2 miles away. 2 miles is nothing in a swimming pool. 2 miles at night, in the Pacific in October, in your clothes with nobody coming, is a different arithmetic entirely. He swam it. Years later, when people asked him how, he did not talk about courage, because he has never once in his life talked about courage. He talked about the lights. There were lights on the shore, and he picked them, and he swam toward them, and he kept his head on those lights, and did not permit himself to think about anything else. Not the cold, not the distance, not the possibility that the current was winning. Pick the light, don't thrash, keep going, get there. You could stop the story right here, and you would already have the man, and everything that would later be called his coldness is in that 2 miles of water. He does not panic, he does not waste a stroke, he does not spend energy on things that are not the light. And if something is not helping him get to shore, he lets go of it, and he does not look back at it, and he does not talk about it afterward. He was 21 years old. Fort Ord gave him one other thing. It gave him company. Kicking around the base and the towns near it were a few other young men who wanted into the movies, including Richard Long and Martin Milner and David Jansen, all of whom would end up on television screens in American living rooms within a decade. They talked about it, somebody knew somebody, and on his time off, he drove down the coast to a little town on the water called Carmel and looked at it and decided that one day he would live there. He was a private in the army with no money and no prospects, and he looked at Carmel and simply filed it away as a thing he would have later. He would eventually not only live there, he would be elected its mayor. They let him out in 1953. He went back to the odd jobs, managing an apartment building, pumping gas, digging out swimming pools, which is a job worth pausing on for a second, because there is something almost funny about a kid who grew up with a pool in Piedmont, spending his 20s in a hole in the ground, digging one for somebody else. He signed up for some classes at Los Angeles City College. In December of that year, he married a secretary named Margaret Johnson, called Maggie. After a courtship measured in weeks, the marriage would last 31 years on paper. It would be something else in practice almost immediately. Within a year, there was a daughter, Laurie, born in 1954, to another woman and placed for adoption, a child he would not know for decades. That pattern started early, and it never really stopped. And it belongs in this story only because it is the same instinct that runs through everything else. He kept his lives in separate rooms. He did not explain the rooms to each other. The way into the movies came through Fort Ord, the way most things did for him. A friend from the base knew somebody on the Universal lot, and somebody walked him in front of a director named Arthur Lubin. And Lubin looked up at 6 feet 4 inches of California and said yes. Then Lubin listened to him read and said something much closer to "oh dear." Because the truth, which Eastwood has never bothered to hide, is that he was not good. He was not remotely good. He signed a contract in April of 1954 at $100 a week, and he went to drama classes on the lot, and the reports came back with a consistency you could set a watch by. He was stiff, he didn't move right. He talked through clenched teeth, which is a hard note to give a man, because how do you unlearn your own jaw? He was slow, he didn't project, and somebody in one of those meetings said out loud that his Adam's apple was too big. Sit with that for a moment. The most photographed face of the 20th century, and a man in a room at Universal in 1954 looked at it and worried about the throat, and they were not being stupid. That is the thing worth saying, because it would be easy to laugh at those men, and they do not deserve it. They were right about all of it. He was stiff, he did talk through his teeth. Watch him in those pictures, and he is exactly as bad as they said. A big handsome plank of a young man reciting. The studio was in the business of turning raw material into product, and they had a system that had worked on hundreds of people, and they ran him through it, and nothing came out the other end. What none of them could have known, what nobody could have known in 1954, is that they were describing a set of assets and calling them defects. The stillness, the refusal to give it away, the mouth that would not open. In 11 years, an Italian would look at exactly those things and see the future of the Western, and every single note in Clint Eastwood's Universal file would turn into money. They weren't wrong about what he was. They were wrong about what it was for. The roles they gave him tell you everything about what the studio thought he was worth. In Revenge of the Creature in 1955, he plays a lab technician who has lost a white rat, and he comes in and says a few words about the rat. And that's the part. He is not the hero. He is the delay before the monster. When he walked onto that set, the director, Jack Arnold, looked at this enormous unknown kid and reportedly said, "What the hell is this?" and came very close to cutting the scene entirely. In Tarantula the same year, he got what a studio in 1955 would have called an upgrade. He plays the jet squadron leader who napalms the giant spider at the end. It is the thing that ends the picture, and he is wearing an oxygen mask and goggles for all of it. You cannot see his face, his whole first year in the movies, and the biggest thing they let him do, he did with his face covered. There was Francis in the Navy, in which he shared the screen with a talking mule and lost. There was a Western called Ambush at Cimarron Pass in 1958 that he would later name, without hesitation, as the worst thing he ever appeared in. And in late 1955, Universal dropped him. Contract over. Thank you and good luck, and don't hit the gate on the way out. Which brings us to the first name. Abner Berman was 15 years older than Clint Eastwood and had lived about 4 lifetimes to Eastwood's none. He was born in Milwaukee in 1909, went to a boys' prep school in Maryland, where he starred in Shakespeare, went on to the University of Pennsylvania, worked for a while as a journalist, and then found his way to New York and to the Group Theater, which was the most serious room in the American theater in the 1930s. His colleagues there included Stella Adler and Clifford Odets and Lee J. Cobb. He did 9 Broadway shows in 4 years. He was in the original cast of Winterset. This was a man who knew what acting was in a way that almost nobody in Hollywood did. Then he came west in 1939, and Hollywood looked at him and saw a face. He was short and thin with dark hair and a still, watchful expression, and the studios decided that expression could be anything they wanted it to be. So they made him a Polynesian. They made him an Indian bandit. They made him a Japanese officer more than once during the war. He played Chota in Gunga Din the year he arrived. He played a hood named Diamond Louis and his girl Friday, opposite Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell. And if you have seen that picture, you have seen him, because he is the one who keeps getting arrested and keeps not staying arrested. He was in Winchester, 73. He was in The Leopard Man. He was a group theater man who spent 20 years in a makeup chair, having his own face taken away and given back as somebody else's. That is the defining quality, and there's the hidden cost. Abner Berman knew exactly what real acting looked like, and Hollywood had never once asked him for it. It had only ever asked him for the cheekbones. So by the middle of the 1950s, he was doing 2 things at Universal. He was coaching the young contract players in the talent program, teaching them the fundamentals he had learned in a room with audits, and the studio at long last was letting him direct. Clint Eastwood, 25 years old, stiff, slow, talking through his teeth, went in to read for one of the first pictures Berman was going to direct. It was a juvenile delinquent picture called Running Wild. There were a lot of young men reading that day. Eastwood was one more. He barely got a word out. Berman waved him off. That was it. A hand in the air, a look, a next please. And the kid from Oakland Tech walked back out into the sunshine on the Universal lot with his ears burning. Eastwood remembered it decades later in exactly the terms that matter. He said Berman made him feel like a punk kid hanging around. Not a bad actor, a punk kid hanging around. A person who did not belong in the building. And you can see it from Berman's side if you want to. He had waited 20 years for a chair with his name on it. He had one afternoon and a room full of nobodies and a schedule. He was a man who had studied with the best people in America and had been paid to play Satsuma in Tahawa and a South Seas Islander. And now, finally, he got to be the one who decided. And in walked 6 feet 4 inches of gorgeous nothing who couldn't say a line. Of course, he waved him off. 99 directors out of 100 would have waved him off. Most of them had. He didn't know what he'd done. There was no reason for him to know. He didn't do anything. That was the point. 4 years later, Clint Eastwood had a series. Rawhide was a hit on CBS, and for the first time in his life, he had a little weight to throw, and he was learning how it worked. The way a young man learns that a word from him in the right office moves things now, when a year ago it moved nothing. And one day, he was in a producer's office, doing whatever actors do in producers' offices, and there was a piece of paper on the desk, a list of directors they were thinking about for upcoming episodes. He looked at it the way you look at anything on somebody else's desk. Abner Berman's name was on it. Eastwood picked up a pencil and drew a line through it. He didn't make a speech. He didn't tell the producer why. He didn't call Berman's agent, or write a letter, or leak a word of it to a columnist. He crossed out a name on a list in an office, and then he went back to work. And Abner Berman, who had directed everything from Gunsmoke to The Twilight Zone in those years, and who would have been perfectly happy to take the paycheck, simply never got the call. Here is how Eastwood explained it. The one and only time he ever really did. "I'm not a vindictive person," he said, "but I just didn't want to see that face on the set." That face. Of all the words available to him, That's the one he reached for, about a man whose entire working life had been spent watching strangers decide what his face was going to be that week. Look at what is not there in that sentence. There is no accusation. He does not say Berman was cruel or unfair or wrong. He does not claim an injury. He does not even claim to be angry. He says he is not vindictive, which is either a lie or, more likely, exactly true, because vindictiveness requires heat, and there is no heat anywhere in this. There is only a preference. He did not care to look at the man, so he didn't. Berman kept working. He directed television steadily for another 20 years, right through to the end, and he died in San Diego in the summer of 1977, 68 years old, at a moment when the punk kid he waved off was the biggest movie star on the planet. If he ever knew that his name had been crossed off a list in 1960, he never said so. Almost certainly, he never knew. That's the cleanest part of it. The verdict was delivered, served, and closed, and the man it was delivered against went to his grave without hearing it. That's the first name, and it sets the rule for every name that follows. Clint Eastwood does not punish people, he deletes them. But Rawhide gave him something else too, something that has been almost entirely forgotten, and it involves the one man on that show he never crossed off, never resented, and never stopped speaking well of. A man who was billed above him for 7 years. A man who handed him the role that made him immortal because he didn't want it himself, and who was dead in a river within a year of losing everything. Rawhide went on the air on CBS at the start of 1959, and it was a cattle drive. That was the whole idea. Every week a herd walked north from San Antonio towards Sedalia, Missouri, in the 1860s, and every week the men driving it ran into somebody's trouble. There was no town. There was no saloon they came home to. There was just the herd and the weather and whatever was over the next rise, and a theme song by Frankie Lane that told them to keep rolling, and that half of America could sing from memory inside of a year. Clint Eastwood was Rowdy Yates, 28 years old, $750 an episode, and for the first time in his life, a steady paycheck for doing the thing he had been told he could not do. He would play Rowdy for 217 episodes across 8 seasons, and by the end of it, he was so tired of the character he could barely stand to put the hat on. Rowdy was the good one. Rowdy was kind to everybody. Rowdy was hot-headed in the way television heroes were allowed to be hot-headed, which is to say, he got mad about the right things and then apologized. Eastwood called him later a conventional white hat, and there was no affection in it. He was spending his early 30s being decent for money. The show was brutal work. Long days, real cattle, real dust, real heat. And here is a detail that will matter enormously to everything that comes after. On a cattle drive set, you cannot yell. You cannot yell because the horses are right there. You cannot yell because 600 steers are standing in the frame, with nothing but nerves between them and open country. So the men who made Rawhide learned to speak quietly on a set, to give direction in a low voice, to never bark the word action into a herd of animals with hooves. Eastwood stood in that world for 8 years, and he watched what happened when a man raised his voice, and he watched what happened when he didn't. He never got over it. 50 years later, Tom Hanks would come off a film with him and tell an interviewer, with a kind of stunned admiration, that Clint Eastwood treats his actors like horses. He meant it exactly the way it sounds. Quiet voice, no sudden movements. All right, go ahead. That's enough of that. Hanks said it was intimidating as hell. The kindness in that method and the cruelty in it come from the same place. Both of them come from the herd. But the man Eastwood spent those 8 years standing next to, the man whose name came first on the screen every single week, has been almost entirely erased from the story of Rawhide, and he deserves better than that. Eric Fleming played the trail boss, Gil Favor. He was the star. On the DVD boxes now, they put Eastwood's face on the front because of what happened afterward. But at the time, there was no question about the order. Fleming was billed first. Fleming got the opening monologue. The two of them essentially traded the lead from week to week. One episode built around Favor, the next around Rowdy, and the show worked because of the balance. And Fleming had come from a place that makes Eastwood's Piedmont swimming pool look like what it was. He was born Edward Hetty Jr. on the 4th of July in 1925, in Santa Paula, California. He was born with a club foot and needed crutches to get anywhere, and his father, a carpenter, beat him for it, beat him badly and often. When the boy was 8 years old, he got hold of a gun and pointed it at his father and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. He ran. 8 years old on a freight train gone. He got as far as Chicago and survived the only way a child alone in Chicago in 1933 could survive, which was by running errands for men who did not ask his age. When he was 11, he was hit by a stray bullet in a gunfight between gangsters and woke up in a hospital, and that is how the authorities found him and sent him home to his mother, who by then had divorced the father and could take him in. He dropped out of school. He worked. Waiter, carpenter, longshoreman, ambulance driver, merchant seaman. When the war came, he went into the Navy. And there, in 1942, a 200-pound block of steel slipped off a hoist and came down on his face. They rebuilt it. 4 operations over a long convalescence. And what they built is the face you see on Rawhide. That granite jaw, that fair, steady, absolutely trustworthy American face that CBS put on the front of a hit Western every Friday night for 7 years. It was a repair job. The trail boss the whole country believed in was a man who had been broken and reassembled by strangers. He and Eastwood got along. This part matters because it is the exception that proves the rule about the list, and because Eastwood, who almost never says anything about anybody, has said this plainly. "We got along great," he told an interviewer decades later. "We were coming from different backgrounds. He was from New York. Everybody got along fairly well on that series. They competed in the good way. Their castmates remembered the two of them trying to break each other up on camera, each one hunting for the thing that would crack the other's composure. They got interested in the animals and insects that turned up on location and would go poke at them together like two boys. Fleming was the senior man and he behaved like it, in the best sense. He was a perfectionist about the work, and he expected it from everyone, including the tall kid who couldn't act, and the tall kid got better. Consider what those 8 years actually were in terms of hours. 217 episodes. A television Western in that era shot in something like 6 days, which means Clint Eastwood spent most of a decade getting up before dawn, putting on the same hat, saying words somebody had typed the previous Thursday, and getting them right the first time because there was no time for a second. Nobody in the modern film business has that training anymore. Nobody gets it. You cannot buy it and you cannot fake it. And it is why he can walk onto a set at 80 and look at a scene and know in about 4 seconds whether it is going to work. He was also, in those years, quietly watching how the machine was run. He was learning which decisions cost money and which ones only cost pride. He was noticing that a director who knows what he wants finishes at 6, and a director who is still deciding finishes at 9, and that the footage is not better at 9. He was becoming a producer, while everybody thought he was being a cowboy, and standing beside him the whole time, first build, patient, generous, was a man whose luck was about to run out completely. And then in 1964, an offer came from Italy. Some producer nobody had heard of wanted an American television cowboy for a Western. They were going to shoot in Spain, on a budget of about $200,000, with an Italian director nobody had heard of either. The script was a copy of a Japanese samurai picture. The money was $15,000 for 11 weeks of your hiatus, in a country where you did not speak the language, in a genre that was already considered a joke. They asked Eric Fleming first. He said no. He had had enough of hard locations and enough of doing things the risky way. He was the star. He was making real money, and he was not about to spend his one break in the year sweating in Almeria for a bunch of Italians. So he passed, and by the accounts of the people who were there, he did more than pass. He pointed them at Eastwood. He helped his co-star get the thing he himself did not want. The picture was a fistful of dollars. The director was Sergio Leone, and that $15,000 hiatus job in Spain would remake the entire Western genre and turn Rowdy Yates into the most recognizable man on earth. Eric Fleming, meanwhile, was about to lose everything, and for the most ordinary of reasons. The ratings were slipping. In 1965, the network cleaned house, and Fleming was gone, along with most of the supporting cast. He told TV Guide that CBS fired him because they were paying him $1 million a year, which was a marvelous line and was not remotely true. It was $220,000. He knew it. He said it anyway because a man who has been beaten with crutches and shot at 11 and had his face rebuilt with a chisel does not walk out of a room admitting he was thrown out. They made Eastwood the trail boss for the last stretch, which he had not asked for and did not want, and he said so. The network moved the show off Friday, where it was the only thing on their schedule that was working, and dropped it on Tuesday opposite Combat, which was chasing the same men who watched Westerns. Rawhide was dead by that winter. Eastwood, dryly, has always explained the cancellation exactly that way. It wasn't the show, it was the scheduling. Somebody wasted it. Fleming landed on his feet for a minute. He did a Doris Day comedy, The Glass Bottom Boat, and got to fall over furniture in it, which was not really his line, but he was game. He did a few bonanzas. He bought a ranch in Hawaii and told people he was going to retire there. He got engaged to a photographer named Lynn Garber and set a date. And then MGM offered him a 2-part adventure to be shot in Peru. And Eric Fleming, who had told Sergio Leone he was done with rugged locations, said yes. He flew into Lima in August of 1966. 6 weeks in, they were at the Huallaga River, near Tingo Maria, and the river there runs for hundreds of miles over boulders the size of houses. The shot was simple enough on paper. Fleming and his co-star Nico Mainardos would paddle a dugout canoe through the rapids and come into shore, with the camera set up downstream. They had done part of it the day before, and it had gone fine. On the 28th of September, there was a storm coming in. They looked at the water, and they looked at the sky, and somebody made a decision, and the decision was not to wait for the storm to pass. Get it now, the light is going. We are 4 hours from anything on a bus. Go. They got in the canoe. The water took it immediately. Fleming, who was a strong swimmer and a surfer, and who had been told to stay with the boat no matter what, decided the boat was finished and jumped for shore. Nico, he said, now or never. Those were the last words anybody heard him say. When he jumped, the canoe turned over and put Mainardos in the water too. Mainardos got out. A local man went in after Fleming and actually reached him, got a hand into his hair and held on. And the river was stronger, and he had to let go or die with him. Fleming went under at a rock and did not come up. They found him 3 days later, well downstream. He was 41 years old. He was to have been married in 2 days. His will left everything to his mother, and was written in such a way that his father would never see a dollar of it, which is a thing a man only does if he has been thinking about it for a very long time. Now hold those two facts next to each other for a moment. Eric Fleming turned down Sergio Leone because he did not want a dangerous location and a rough shoot, and handed the part to Clint Eastwood. And then Eric Fleming died on a dangerous location in a rough shoot because a crew looked at a storm and decided not to lose the afternoon. There is no villain in that. Nobody murdered him. Somebody just did the arithmetic that everybody in the picture business does 40 times a day. The arithmetic that says the light is going, and we are burning money, and we can make it. And the arithmetic was wrong. It is the same arithmetic Clint Eastwood would build his entire career on. Don't wait, don't waste it, get it and go. He would be praised for it for 50 years, and given 4 Academy Awards while doing it. And it is 1 inch away, 1 single inch, from the thing that put his friend in the Huallaga River. He has never connected those two things out loud. There's no reason to think he ever has privately either. But he took the job Fleming didn't want, and he became what Fleming was supposed to become, and he has now outlived him by 60 years. Spain then, Almeria in the winter of 1964, and a director named Sergio Leone, who spoke almost no English. They could barely talk to each other. Leone directed him by acting it out, standing there in the dust doing the thing himself, and saying, essentially, watch me. Eastwood picked up a little Italian. The rest was mime and instinct, and 2 men circling the same idea from opposite sides of a language barrier. And what they built between them was not a character. It was a hole in the middle of the movie, where a character should be. Leone wanted a mask. Eastwood, who had spent 8 years being told to project and emote and be rowdy, understood something the Italians did not. that the American Western hero explains himself constantly, and that the audience had stopped believing him. So he started cutting. He cut lines out of the script. He cut reactions. He put on a poncho and hid his body. He pulled a hat down over his eyes and hid his face. He put a cigar in his mouth, which he loathed, because he did not smoke and never has, and it made him sick. And he kept it there because it kept his mouth busy and gave him something to do with the lower half of a face that was otherwise going to have to act. And the squint, half of it was the sun. He has admitted that much. Almeria is blinding, but the squint did something no acting coach at Universal ever could. It made a man who was famously hard to read into a man who was impossible to read. And the audience did what audiences always do with a blank. They filled it in. 10 years earlier, a room full of professionals at Universal had told him he was stiff, that he didn't move enough, that he didn't give them anything. In Spain, for $15,000 and a Mercedes, he took every single one of those defects and turned them into the most valuable screen persona of the second half of the century. He didn't fix himself. He just found the one man alive who wanted him broken. A fistful of dollars landed in Europe like a brick through a window. Then came for a few dollars more in 1965 with Lee Van Cleef, and the budgets got bigger, and the shots got longer, and Ennio Morricone's music started doing half the acting. Then The Good, The Bad, and the Ugly in 1966, with Eli Wallach chewing everything in Spain that wasn't nailed down. By the end of it, Clint Eastwood was a star on a continent that had never heard of Rowdy Yates. And when United Artists finally put the 3 films into American theaters in 1967, all at once, the country that had passed on him for a decade discovered him in a single summer. And then he walked away from Sergio Leone and never came back. There was no explosion. There was never an explosion. There were 3 reasons and they stacked. The first was money, which is the reason people always assume, and which is always the least interesting one. He wanted a great deal more for the third picture than he had for the first, and he got it. And Leone thought the number was obscene, and both of them were right. The second was arithmetic. Leone was becoming an artist in the grand manner, and grand manner costs hours. He would spend a day, a real working day, on a shot of a man's eyes. He would build an entire graveyard in the Spanish dirt, and then circle it with a camera for as long as it took. Eastwood watched all of this from inside the poncho, sweating, with a cigar he hated in his mouth, and did the sum. Later he described what Leone had become with a line that is affectionate and lethal at once. He said Sergio wanted to be David Lean, in Italian. The third reason is the one that tells you the most about him. By the third film, he was not alone in the frame anymore. Eli Wallach was extraordinary in that picture, extraordinary in a big, generous, hungry way, and he took the movie in both hands and ran with it. Eastwood noticed the whole architecture that made him work, the stillness, the blank, the hole in the middle, that the audience fills in, only functions if the camera has nowhere else to look. Give the audience a Tuco, and they will look at Tuco. Understand that this was not vanity, or at least not only vanity. It was a working actor's cold assessment of the only property he had ever managed to build, which was an absence. And absences are fragile things that only exist by contrast. A man who says nothing is fascinating in a room full of people saying things, and he is invisible in a room full of people who are more interesting than he is. Eastwood had spent 8 years on Rawhide being the second most interesting man in every scene, and he had climbed out of that hole by inventing a character who could not be upstaged, because there was nothing there to upstage. And now here came Eli Wallach, sweating and gabbling and stealing Spain, and the whole beautiful trick was failing in front of him at 24 frames a second. So Leone offered him Once Upon a Time in the West, and he said no, and Charles Bronson got it. Leone came to him later with the beginnings of a gangster epic that would eventually become Once Upon a Time in America, and he said no to that too. He said the script wasn't finished. He said there was no punchline. Underneath all of it was the simplest thing in the world. He had already done the poncho. Doing it again was not a career, it was a costume. And here is where you have to be careful, because this is the first place the pattern splits into two. Eastwood never worked with Leone again. He also never said an unkind word about him that anybody has been able to find. He talked about him warmly for the rest of his life. He said that if he was going through the channels late at night, and the good, the bad, and the ugly was on, he stopped and watched it. When Leone died of a heart attack in 1989, at 60, Eastwood turned up at the tributes. 3 years later, when he made the film that finally won him everything, the greatest Western of the modern era, he put a dedication on the end of it. 2 words, Sergio and Don. There are 2 kinds of never again in this man's life. And if you can't tell them apart, you will read the whole story wrong. There is the door he closes because the room no longer serves him. And there is the door he closes because somebody is on the other side of it. Leone got the first kind. He was loved and he was left, and those were not contradictions. The next man got the second kind. And it took a mountain in Oregon and $20 million to make it happen. Paint Your Wagon should never have been made. And by 1968, everybody in Hollywood, except the people making it, seemed to understand that. It was a Lerner and Loewe stage musical from 1951, mildly successful, about the gold rush. Paramount decided to turn it into a giant roadshow picture at exactly the moment when giant roadshow musicals were going out the window all over town. They hired Paddy Chayefsky, of all people, to rewrite it, and he threw out most of the plot and gave them a story about 2 prospectors who buy a wife at auction and then decide to share her, which was Paramount's idea of speaking to the young people. They cast Lee Marvin as Ben Rumson, they cast Jean Seberg as the wife, and they cast Clint Eastwood, 38 years old and fresh off Where Eagles Dare, as a man called Pardner, and they had him sing. Then somebody flew over a valley in the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, 42 miles northeast of Baker, Oregon, and said, "There, that's the place." There was nothing there. That was the appeal. It was also the problem. It was 90 minutes of driving from the nearest hotel bed, up an unpaved forest road, and the director, Joshua Logan, said out loud that this was madness and was overruled. So Paramount built a town. They built No Name City from nothing on Eagle Creek at a cost of $2.5 million and 7 months of labor, complete with tunnels underneath it and hydraulic lifts inside the buildings, so the whole place could collapse on cue at the end. Then they bussed 700 people up that road every morning and back down every night. Eastwood took a helicopter. Read that again, because it is the entire man in one detail. Everybody else got on the bus for 90 minutes each way. He looked at 3 hours a day of his life going out the window and simply refused to participate. Then it rained, and the rain destroyed the road, and Paramount paid $10,000 a mile to rebuild it. The hippies they had hired as extras, actual hippies, organized themselves into a union and threatened to strike unless the day rate went to $25. Alan J. Lerner, who wrote the thing and produced it, nearly went off a 400-foot cliff. There was a trained black bear in the picture, and in the evenings somebody would bring the bear into the taverns in Baker so the locals could wrestle it, and people in that town were still talking about the animal's breath 50 years later. And in the middle of all of it, day after day after day, stood Lee Marvin, magnificently and comprehensively drunk. You have to understand who Lee Marvin was to understand why this was allowed. He was not a lush who had lucked into a career. He was a Marine. He had gone into the Pacific as a teenager and come out of Saipan with a wound that severed his sciatic nerve, and he carried that and everything else he saw out there for the rest of his life. He came home and started acting almost by accident, and for 15 years, he was the most frightening man in American pictures, the one who threw scalding coffee in Gloria Graham's face in The Big Heat, the one who terrified you before he opened his mouth. Then in 1965, he won the Academy Award for Cat Ballou, playing a drunk, playing 2 men actually. One of them, a gunfighter so pickled he could barely stay on a horse, and he was so funny and so precise and so sad in it that the Academy handed him the statue, and Hollywood decided it loved him. That is the defining quality, and here is the cost. Lee Marvin was a genuinely great actor who had discovered that the industry would pay him $1 million to be exactly as ruined as he actually was. There was no line anymore between the performance and the condition. He turned down the Wild Bunch to make Paint Your Wagon because Paramount offered him $1 million and a piece of the gross, and then he showed up in Oregon and drank his way through the entire production. On most pictures, the whiskey in the bottle is tea. On this one, Lee Marvin would not work unless the whiskey was whiskey. His prop bottle was full. Joshua Logan fought him about it and lost, because you cannot fire the man whose name is above the title on a picture that is already $12 million in the hole. Think about the negotiation that had to happen for that. Somebody, a grown adult on a payroll, had the job of going to the property master every morning and confirming that the bottle Mr. Marvin drinks out of in scene 41 has real bourbon in it, because Mr. Marvin can tell, and if it's tea, we lose the day. That was a line item. That was in the budget, and Marvin was not hiding it and was not ashamed of it, and probably could not have explained it to you. There is a photograph in the mind of every person who was on that mountain. A decorated Marine in a filthy prospector's coat, 60 feet from a $2.5 million fake town, in the rain, working through a real bottle at 10 in the morning, and being magnificent in front of the camera anyway. So the days ran long. Takes were blown and reshot and blown again. Setups collapsed because the leading man could not stand where he had stood the take before. And Clint Eastwood, 38 years old, watched. He watched it every single day for months. He watched $2.5 million of buildings sit empty in the rain while everybody waited. He watched a genius throw his own gift into a bottle in front of 400 people, and he watched the studio pay for the privilege. Here is the thing about it that must have driven him past all bearing. It was not that Marvin was bad. Marvin was wonderful. Everybody agrees he was wonderful. He steals the film, and his song, a gravel-voiced dirge called Wandrin, star that he essentially spoke rather than sang, went to #1 in Britain and earned him a gold record, which is one of the most ridiculous facts in the history of popular music. Gene Seberg said his singing sounded like rain gurgling down a rusty pipe, and she meant it as an insult, and the whole country bought it anyway. The drinking was not hurting the performance, it was only hurting the clock, and the clock was the only religion Eastwood had. The picture cost at least $20 million, which made it about the third most expensive film ever made at that point. Paramount fired Joshua Logan after 5 months and had an assistant director finish it, uncredited. It came out in October of 1969, ran nearly 3 hours, and the reviews came in like a firing squad. Rex Reed called it a monument to unparalleled incompetence. Roger Ebert wrote that it did not even inspire a put-down, that it just lay there in his mind, a big heavy lump. The paper in Portland called it a 2-ton marshmallow. It made money, actually, in the end, $31 million, and it was Paramount's 6th biggest hit up to that point. It just never came close to what it cost. Eastwood's verdict on it is the coldest sentence of his career, and it is not about art at all. It was a disaster, he said, but it didn't have to be such an expensive disaster. $20 million down the drain, and most of it doesn't even show on the screen. Not we made a bad film, not the songs were foolish and I cannot sing. He said, you cannot see the money. That is a producer talking. That is a man who has stopped being an employee. And he said something else about those months in Oregon that is the hinge of his entire life. He said the experience strengthened his resolve to become a director, not because he had visions, because he had been on a bus, spiritually speaking, for a year, and he was never getting on one again. He never worked with Lee Marvin again, not once in the 20 years Marvin had left, and he never said a word against him, ever, because there was nothing to say. Marvin wasn't cruel to him. Marvin didn't sabotage him. Marvin was a war hero and an Oscar winner, and on that mountain, a man being eaten alive by something he had brought home from the Pacific in 1944, and everybody could see it, and nobody could do anything about it. And Paramount kept the bottles coming because the dailies were good. Eastwood didn't hate him. He just wrote him down in the column marked cost. But there was somebody else on that mountain, somebody who did not get the helicopter, and did not get the gold record, and did not get to walk away with a lesson. Somebody who was 29 years old, quietly terrified, married to a man in Paris, and falling in love with Clint Eastwood in a cabin in the woods. 9 years later, she would be dead in a locked car, and the reason had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with a machine that was already grinding toward her while they were up there singing about gold. She was the girl who got burned at the stake at 18, and in a way, she never got out of the fire. Jean Seberg came from Marshalltown, Iowa, born in November of 1938, the daughter of a pharmacist and a substitute teacher, raised Lutheran in a town where nothing happened, and everybody knew your grandmother. She was smart and restless and prettier than the county could account for, and in 1956 Otto Preminger announced a nationwide talent search for a girl to play Joan of Arc. 18,000 girls tried out. He picked her. Think about what that does to a 17-year-old. One morning you are in Iowa. That afternoon a famous Austrian with a shaved head is telling photographers that he has discovered you, and the newspapers are running the word Cinderella, and you are on a soundstage in England being fitted for armor. Then they filmed the ending. The ending of St. John is the stake. They built the pyre and they lit it, and the flames got away from them. And Jean Seberg, 18 years old, standing tied to a post in the middle of it, was actually burned. Not badly enough to stop the picture, badly enough to leave marks. The film came out in 1957, and the critics did to her what the fire hadn't. They said she couldn't act. They said Preminger had ruined her before she started. They were reviewing a teenager from Iowa who had been handed one of the hardest roles in the language and given no training and no protection. And they wrote about her like she was a bad hire. Preminger, who had made the mess, mostly watched. She was famous before she was anything, which is the worst order to do it in. He put her in one more, Bonjour Tristesse, and she cut her hair off for it, cropped short and boyish, and that haircut escaped the movie and went out into the world on its own. Then Jean-Luc Godard, who had watched Bonjour Tristesse and seen something in her that Americans could not see, put her on a street in Paris in 1960, selling the Herald Tribune in a striped shirt with that hair, and Breathless changed what movies were allowed to be. A girl from Marshalltown became the face of French cinema, not a French actress, the idea of France, for a whole generation of people who had never been. That is the defining quality, and here is the cost. Jean Seberg was worshipped for a surface. The hair, the eyes, the shirt, the profile in the doorway. Almost nobody was interested in what she could actually do, and she spent the rest of her life being handed to men who wanted the image and had no use for the woman inside it. She married a French director at 19. Then she married Ramin Gary, the novelist and diplomat and war hero, a man of towering seriousness who was 24 years older than she was. And in the summer of 1968, she went to a mountain in Oregon to be in a musical. She got the part almost by default. Faye Dunaway said no. Mia Farrow said no. Tuesday Weld said no. They talked about Julie Andrews and Diana Rigg. A young Paramount contract player got the job and then had to withdraw because she was pregnant. And so the part of Elizabeth, the woman two prospectors buy at auction and agree to share, went to Jean Seberg, who by her own account got a nudge from Clint Eastwood himself, who she said pulled a few strings on her behalf, which means the two of them may already have known each other rather well. Before anybody got to Oregon, she was 30, he was 38, married, and living out a set of arrangements that his wife had long since decided not to inspect too closely. Up in the Wallowas, while the rain came down and Lee Marvin drank, and the studio bled money into a forest, they found each other. He kept a cabin in the woods to get away from the chaos of the set. She went there. By every account it was serious, at least for her. For the first time in years, she thought about leaving Gary. Not a fling, a life. Meanwhile, the picture was busy telling her exactly what it thought she was worth. Eastwood sings in Paint Your Wagon. Lee Marvin sings in Paint Your Wagon, and his song about wandering went to #1 in Britain, and Seberg was the one who said his voice sounded like rain in a rusty pipe. And Jean Seberg does not sing in Paint Your Wagon. They dubbed her. A singer named Anita Gordon did her one number because the studio decided the men's rough voices were charming, and the woman's real one was not usable. She is in the film for 3 hours, and you never hear her. The affair ended, depending on which account you take, in one of two ways. Some say it ended in Oregon, when Ramin Gary flew in from Paris, arrived on the set, and challenged Clint Eastwood to a duel, which is exactly the sort of thing a French novelist of a certain generation would do, and exactly the sort of thing Clint Eastwood would have absolutely no idea what to do with. And some say it ended in Los Angeles, quietly, in the way that hurts more. Her publicist at the time was a man named Jerry Pam, and years later, after she was dead, he told her biographer what he had watched. Once they got back to Paramount, he said, it was as if Clint didn't know who she was. Gene couldn't believe he could be that indifferent to her. After everything that had gone on in Baker, she was a very vulnerable woman, and it was a terrible trauma for her. That's the whole mechanism, described by a man who was standing next to it. Not a fight, not a scene, not a bad word. He simply came down off the mountain, and she was no longer in the frame, and the machinery that had been aimed at her for 6 months turned off like a lamp. Eastwood, decades later, said of her that he adored her and that she had played a very important role in his life. He is not a man who says things like that. It may well be the warmest sentence he has ever spoken about anyone he worked with, and it arrived long after she could hear it. They never made another film together. There was never any question of it. He simply moved on, the way he always moved on, and that would be the end of Gene Seberg's part in the Clint Eastwood story. Except that it isn't, and the reason it isn't has nothing to do with him at all. Because while she was up on that mountain, a file was thickening in Washington. Gene Seberg had a conscience, which in Hollywood is closer to a medical condition. She gave money to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She gave money to a Native American school back near Marshalltown, and she gave money, roughly $10,000 over time, to the Black Panther Party, and she made a phone call to one of its leaders, and that was enough. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under J. Edgar Hoover, was running a program called COINTELPRO, and had been for over a decade. The purpose of it was to find Americans whose politics the Bureau disliked, and take them apart, not arrest them, take them apart, break their marriages, ruin their reputations, make their friends distrust them, make their employers nervous. And you should understand who was on that list with her, because the company tells you what the crime was. They went after Martin Luther King. They went after writers, and professors and church groups, and women's organizations, and boys who did not want to go to Vietnam. Gene Seberg's file existed because a girl from Iowa had written some checks and made a phone call. Hoover personally signed off on going after her. The memo exists, you can read it. The Bureau's stated aim was the neutralization of Gene Seberg, and a secondary aim, in the actual words of the men who wrote it, was to cause her embarrassment and serve to cheapen her image with the general public. Another official described her in an internal document as a promiscuous and sex-perverted white actress. These were federal employees. This was their job that day. In the spring of 1970, she was pregnant. The Bureau saw an opening. They cooked up a lie, sourced it to an informant so it could not be traced back, and fed it to a gossip columnist at the Los Angeles Times named Joyce Haber. Haber ran it in August. She didn't use Seberg's name. She didn't have to. She called her Miss A, and then she told her readers that Miss A was the blonde star of a big musical movie, and that Miss A was expecting, and that Papa was said to be a rather prominent Black Panther. Read that again slowly. The big musical movie was Paint Your Wagon. The Bureau of Investigation of the United States, in order to destroy a woman for giving money to the wrong charity, identified her to the entire country by pointing at the film she had just made with Clint Eastwood. That picture, the 2-ton marshmallow, the $20 million you couldn't see on the screen, the thing everybody involved wanted to forget, was the tag they hung around her neck. 3 weeks later, Newsweek printed it with her actual name in it. She read the story. She went into labor early. On the 23rd of August, 1970, she gave birth by cesarean to a daughter, Nina, who weighed under 4 pounds. The baby lived 2 days. She took her home, not to Paris, not to Los Angeles. She took that child back to Marshalltown, Iowa, and buried her at Riverside Cemetery, among the people who had known Gene Seberg when she was a pharmacist's daughter, and she made sure that people saw the baby, because the lie had been about who the baby's father was, and there was only one way left to answer it. The father, as it happened, was neither Ramin Gary nor anybody from the Black Panther Party. He was a young Mexican revolutionary named Carlos Ornelas Navarro, whom she had met on a film in Durango. Gary claimed the child publicly as his own to protect her. Not one part of what the FBI told the country was true. She did not recover. Ramin Gary said afterward that she tried to kill herself every year on the anniversary of Nina's death. Every August, like a season, she drank. She was afraid of the phone. Her work dried up and she believed, probably correctly, that there was a quiet list somewhere with her name on it. In July of 1979, she threw herself in front of a train in the Paris metro and lived. On the 30th of August, 1979, she went out and did not come back. 9 days later, they found her in the back seat of her own small car, parked near her apartment in the 16th arrondissement, wrapped in a blanket. There was a bottle of barbiturates and an empty bottle of mineral water, and a note in French to her son Diego. "Forgive me," it said. "I can no longer live with my nerves." She was 40 years old. The police called it a probable suicide, and the coroner was careful enough about the details to leave the file open. And the following year, the French filed charges against persons unknown for failing to help a person in danger, and nothing ever came of it. Ramin Gary called a press conference within days. He stood in front of the cameras and said the FBI had done this. He said the lie in 1970 had made her psychotic, and that everything after it was the working out of that lie. People treated him at first like a grieving man saying wild things. 2 weeks after she died, the Federal Bureau of Investigation admitted it had planted the story. The New York Times ran that admission in September of 1979. The Bureau conceded it. There was no lawsuit that forced it, no whistleblower. They simply confirmed that they had done it after she was in the ground. Ramin Gary shot himself the following year. Now, what does any of this have to do with Clint Eastwood? Nothing. That has to be said clearly, because this is a story about a list, and it would be very easy and very cheap to put a woman's death on a man's account because he was unkind to her in 1969. He wasn't the FBI, he didn't write the memo. He didn't plant the story. He was a movie star who had an affair on location and then stopped returning her calls, which describes roughly half the men in that industry in that decade, and which is not a crime, and which did not kill her. But here is what he did do, and it is worth naming precisely, because it is the exact thing he does to everyone. He turned it off. She came off that mountain thinking she had found something. He came off that mountain having learned an expensive lesson about production schedules, and she walked back into a life that was about to be dismantled by professionals, alone, with one fewer person in it. He never spoke against her. There was no reason to. She had not cost him a day. Of all the doors he ever closed, that one closed the softest, and the woman on the other side of it never even heard the latch. There is one more thing, and it is the strangest fact in this entire story, and it will not mean much for another 40 years. In 2011, Clint Eastwood made a film about the man who ordered it. He put Leonardo DiCaprio in a fat suit and old-age makeup and spent 2 hours of screen time crawling around inside the head of J. Edgar Hoover. And on that set, he lost the last name he would ever lose. Hold that thought. It's 2011 and it will keep, because there are 40 years of names to get through first, and the next one arrives on the back of a small gray animal in Mexico. To understand her, you have to understand the man standing behind the camera, because he is the one who taught Clint Eastwood how to be dangerous. Don Siegel was born in Chicago in 1912, and he was the least likely tough guy in Hollywood. He was educated in England. He came into the business through the film library at Warner Brothers, sorting other people's footage, and he was so good at cutting film together that they put him in charge of the montages, those flurries of images that push a story forward, the newspaper spinning, the map with the moving line, the war closing in on Europe. He cut those. If you have watched Casablanca, you have watched Don Siegel's work in the first 2 minutes without ever knowing it. Then they let him direct, and what came out was lean and mean and cheap and fast. Riot in Cell Block 11, Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956, which is a horror film about neighbors and a masterpiece, and was made for nothing in 19 days. The Killers in 1964, with a retired actor named Ronald Reagan in his final screen role, slapping Angie Dickinson. Siegel's whole philosophy came out of the B-picture trenches, and it was not artistic, it was tactical. He cut the picture in the camera. That meant he shot only what he intended to use, and he shot it in the order it would go together. And he deliberately did not give the studio extra angles. Why? Because if you don't shoot it, they can't use it. If there's no coverage, there's nothing to recut. A producer with a full set of options can take your film away from you in the editing room. A producer, with only the shots you chose to give him, has to release your movie. Efficiency as self-defense, speed as a weapon. That was the lesson. And Clint Eastwood took it like a communion wafer. They met on Coogan's Bluff in 1968, and it began badly. Segel rewrote the script, and Eastwood read the rewrite and hated it, and they had it out. Really had it out at volume, with at least one screw you thrown across the room, which is remarkable mostly because it is the only recorded instance of Clint Eastwood raising his voice at a colleague in 65 years of employment. And then they made up and became close, and made 5 films together. Segel gave him Dirty Harry. Segel gave him Escape from Alcatraz. Segel gave him The Beguiled, which is the strangest thing Eastwood ever appeared in, and the one where he is genuinely frightened for 2 hours. And when Eastwood directed his own first film, Play Misty for Me, in 1971, he cast Don Segel in it as a bartender. The mentor stood behind a bar in his student's movie and poured drinks, and said his lines and went home. That is real affection. That happened, which brings us to Mexico, and to a woman with 3 Academy Award nominations, and to a small gray animal that nobody has ever stopped arguing about. The script came to Eastwood from Elizabeth Taylor, of all people. He was in Austria shooting Where Eagles Dare with her husband Richard Burton, and she handed him a Western about a mercenary and a nun, and said she wanted to play the nun. It was offered to her. She had to turn it down, because the picture was going to shoot in Mexico, and she wanted to be in Spain, where Burton would be working. That is how Elizabeth Taylor made decisions, and nobody ever held it against her. The Nun was written Mexican. Eastwood wanted Sergio Leone to direct it, which tells you their break was about hours and money, and not about hard feelings. He got Don Segel instead, which was better, and Universal cast Shirley MacLaine, who is from Virginia, and Eastwood understood exactly why. The studio had a musical called Sweet Charity coming out, and enormous hopes for it, and they wanted their girl in another picture. That's how casting worked. Nobody was embarrassed. Sweet Charity, when it opened, was one of the biggest flops of the decade. Shirley MacLaine was 35 years old and had been a professional since she was a child. She was born in Richmond in 1934, and her mother put her into ballet because her ankles were weak, which is the least romantic origin story in show business and the truest one. She danced her way into the Broadway chorus, and in 1954, she was understudying a star named Carol Haney in The Pajama Game, and 4 days after the show opened, Carol Haney broke her ankle. MacLaine went on. Hal Wallis was in the house that night. That is the story every chorus kid in America was told to keep them going, and it happened to exactly one person, and it happened to her. She was in Hollywood within months. Hitchcock used her. Then some came running with Sinatra and Dean Martin, and her first Oscar nomination. Then Billy Wilder handed her The Apartment in 1960, and she gave one of the great American performances, a woman with a cracked heart making jokes so nobody would look at it. Another nomination, then Irma La Douce, a third. By 1970, Shirley MacLaine had been nominated 3 times, and Clint Eastwood had never been nominated for anything, and never would be for acting until he was over 60. Here is her defining quality, and it is a virtue. She asked questions. She wanted to know why. She had come up in an era when performance was starting to mean something, and she had worked with Wilder, who could tell you the reason for every syllable, and she carried into every job the reasonable belief that if a scene did not make sense, somebody should be able to explain it. And here is the cost. On a Don Segel picture in Mexico in 1969, there were no reasons. There was a schedule. The shoot was 65 days near Tlayacapan in the state of Morelos, with the interiors done in Mexico City. Around $4 million. The food and the water got into people, and most of the cast and crew, MacLaine included, spent part of that picture genuinely ill. Morricone wrote the score, which is why a modest Universal Western sounds like a cathedral. There is a rattlesnake sequence Segel was proud of. There is a scene where MacLaine gets Eastwood drunk enough to cut an arrow out of his shoulder, and he sings an old murder ballad through his teeth while she does it, and it is genuinely the best acting of his early career. And then there was the burro. MacLaine had to get off the animal. She said with total conviction that you do not dismount a burro from the left, you dismount from the right. She knew it, she said so, and she did it her way. The problem was that dismounting on the right took her out of the master shot. The camera was on the other side. Whatever she knew about burrows, the geometry of the scene had just collapsed, and the master was gone. And she was probably correct about the animal. That is what makes it perfect. Everything about this, the whole absurd thing, hangs on the fact that Shirley MacLaine had gone and found out something true and was not willing to do a false thing on camera because a lens had been put in an inconvenient place. She had spent 15 years learning that details are the entire job. Billy Wilder had taught her that a woman's whole life can live in the way she holds a compact. And Don Siegel had spent 30 years learning that you get the master, then you get the pieces, then you go home, and that the audience does not know which side of a burrow anybody gets off. Two people were right. That is almost always what a blow-up on a film set is. Two people being right about two different jobs. What followed was not a discussion. It was a blow-up in front of the entire crew, between a director who had cut Casablanca's montages and an actress who had been nominated 3 times, both of them screaming, with 100 people standing in the Mexican sun, watching 2 adults come apart over an animal's flank. They both walked off, production stopped. Siegel wrote about her afterward in his memoir, and what he wrote is ugly and worth quoting exactly, because it is the honest sound of 1969. He said it was hard to feel any great warmth toward her. He said she was too unfeminine. He said she had too much of a certain quality no man was supposed to admire in a woman, and that she was very, very hard. He was calling her difficult. What he meant was that she would not be handled. Now here is the part the clickbait always leaves out, and it changes everything. They fixed it. Siegel and MacLaine went off and had a private conversation, just the two of them, and came back, and the rest of the shoot went smoothly. Siegel himself said the rest of it was a breeze, and that she was a total professional. His real enemy on that picture was never her at all. It was the producer, Marty Rakin, who fought him on everything and who, as Siegel put it, kept walking away saying, "I lose the battles, but I win the war." And Rakin did win it. He took the final cut. The film came out in the spring of 1970 and got warm reviews. The New York Times said it stayed and grew on the mind the way only movies of exceptional narrative intelligence do. Everybody praised the chemistry between the two leads, which was real and which they achieved while barely tolerating each other's methods. So where does that leave Shirley MacLaine on the list? She is on it. That is simply a fact. 2 Mules for Sister Sarah came out in 1970. Shirley MacLaine worked steadily for the next 50 years and won an Academy Award and became one of the most beloved figures in the country. Clint Eastwood directed more than 40 films in that time and cast half of Hollywood in them, twice. He never worked with her again. Not once. Not a cameo, not a favor, not a scene. And he never said a word against her either. Nothing. Go and look. Siegel wrote the ugly paragraph. Eastwood wrote nothing. He was in the room for all of it. The burrow, the shouting, the walkout, the shutdown. And he watched and he kept his face still. And he went back to his trailer because he was not angry with her. That is what people get wrong. There is no evidence anywhere that Clint Eastwood disliked Shirley MacLaine as a human being. What he took away from that shoot was structural, and he acted on it immediately and permanently. 2 Mules for Sister Sarah is the last film in which Clint Eastwood ever took second billing. Ever. In 56 more years of work, his name never came second again. He had watched what happens when a set has 2 centers of gravity. He had watched a director and a star tear a day and half in public, because there was no one on that ground with the authority to end it. And he understood, standing in the dust in Morelos, that the problem was not the woman and was not the director. The problem was that a movie set is a democracy right up until somebody owns it, and that he was not going to spend the rest of his life in somebody else's democracy. Within a year, he had directed his own picture. Within 6, he would fire a man for the sin of caring about a beer can. As for Don Siegel, the ending is the gentlest kind of sad. They made Dirty Harry together in 1971, and it changed the country. They made Escape from Alcatraz in 1979, and it is a small perfect thing, and it was the last one. In between, somewhere around the middle of the 70s, the temperature dropped. The conversations got pointed. The mentor started giving notes to a man who no longer needed notes, and the student started making decisions before the mentor had finished the sentence. Nothing happened, no fight, no falling out anybody can point to. Clint Eastwood simply grew past him, and past the need for him, and the affection stayed but the work stopped. That is the cruelest thing a student can do to a teacher, and there is no way to make it not happen, and it is not anybody's fault. Don Siegel had spent his life learning to make a good picture in 19 days for no money, because nobody would give him 19 weeks or any money, and he had handed all of that hard-won craft to a younger man, who then went out and used it to get everything Siegel had never been given, the budgets and the final cut, and the studio that said yes before he finished the sentence. The pupil took the survival skills of a poor man and became a rich one with them. And there is a particular silence that settles over a friendship when one person no longer needs anything the other person has, and both of them can feel it, and neither of them will ever mention it. And it goes on being a friendship right up until you notice that it has been 4 years since anybody called. In 1992, he made Unforgiven and won everything there was to win with it, and he put a dedication on the last card. Sergio and Don, the two men who made him, one of whom he outgrew and one of whom he outgrew, both dead by then, both thanked in public in the only way he knows how to thank anybody, quietly, late, and in writing. That's the good kind of never again. The next one was not. In 1973, a young man came to Clint Eastwood with pages, and Clint Eastwood did something he almost never did. He gave him the keys. Michael Cimino was from New York, Yale-educated, a maker of television commercials with an eye that everybody who met him remarked on. He had co-written Magnum Force, the second Dirty Harry picture, and Eastwood liked him. And when Cimino turned up with a script about a bank robber and a drifter driving around Montana, Eastwood put his own company behind it and let a first-timer direct him. Thunderbolt and Lightfoot came out in 1974. It is a lovely, strange, sad little picture, and the best thing in it is a 24-year-old named Jeff Bridges playing a boy who is too sweet for the life he has chosen. Two things happened after it, and Eastwood's reaction to both of them tells you the shape of the man. The first is that Malpaso, which is to say Eastwood rode herd on Cimino the entire way through, watched him, managed him, kept the schedule tight. Cimino, years later, said of that film with some care that it wasn't really his. He didn't accuse anybody of anything. He just declined to claim it. The second is that when the Academy Award nominations came out, Jeff Bridges was on the list for Best Supporting Actor. Clint Eastwood was not on any list. He had never been on any list. He had carried 5 of the top-grossing pictures in America, and the Academy had never once said his name. And now a boy he had personally hired and personally paid was nominated for standing next to him. He was, by the accounts of people around him at the time, quietly furious, not at Bridges, who deserved it, and who Eastwood never said a word against. At the studio, United Artists had made no effort for him, and he decided in that moment that he was finished with United Artists, and he was for years. That's the pettiest thing in this entire story, and it is also the most human. The man was 44 years old, the biggest star in the world, and nobody had ever told him he was any good at it. Now hold that thought and jump forward 6 years, because Michael Cimino is about to become the single greatest argument for everything Clint Eastwood believes. Cimino made The Deer Hunter in 1978, and it won Best Picture and Best Director, and Hollywood decided he was a genius, and Hollywood was right. Then United Artists, the studio that had not bothered to campaign for Clint Eastwood, gave that genius a Western and got out of his way. He shot over 1 million feet of film. He tore down a street that had already been built because it was 6 feet too narrow. He waited for hours, for days, for the clouds to come in and look the way he wanted them to look. The budget went from about $11 million to more than 40. Heaven's Gate opened in 1980, was slaughtered, and took United Artists down with it. The studio that had released the Dollars trilogy in America and made Clint Eastwood a star at home ceased, effectively, to exist. Eastwood swore off United Artists in 1975 because they didn't get him a nomination. The joke was that he was right. He was just right for the wrong reason. And he never worked with Michael Cimino again. And Michael Cimino never worked much again either. And it was not personal. It was never personal. Cimino was a man who wanted the cloud to be perfect, and Eastwood was a man who had once swum 2 miles at night by refusing to look at anything but a light on a shore. And there is no world in which those two men make a second picture together. One of them had to be destroyed by his gift. It was not going to be the one from Oakland Tech, which brings us at last to the most famous name Clint Eastwood ever crossed off a list, and the only one that changed the rules of the entire American film industry. Philip Kaufman was 39 years old and one of the most interesting men in American movies. He was from Chicago, a Harvard law dropout who had gone to Europe and read too much and come back wanting to make films. He had made a Western in 1972 called The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid, about Jesse James, which was odd and thoughtful, and did not do what Westerns were supposed to do. Later, he would make Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and The Right Stuff, and The Unbearable Lightness of Being. He was a serious man with a serious head. He was hired to write and direct The Outlaw Josey Wales. The material came from a strange, dark corner. The novel was published in 1972 by a man calling himself Forrest Carter, who wrote about a Missouri farmer whose family is murdered and who goes to war against the government and never stops. It is a furious, beautiful, deeply frightening book. And Forrest Carter, it turned out, was Asa Earl Carter, a Ku Klux Klan organizer from Alabama and a speechwriter for George Wallace. He is the man who wrote the words segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Nobody knew that yet. It came out later, partly because the movie got famous. Kaufman read the novel and saw both things at once, the power in it and the poison. So he set out to keep the drawl and the tobacco and the shape of the thing, while sanding down what he considered its crude, fascist politics. He wanted the beauty and not the sickness. Eastwood wanted the whole animal. That was the argument, and it was a real one, between two intelligent men who both had a point. But the argument that actually ended it was smaller than that and stupider, and it involved a prop. The story that has come down, and Kaufman has never disputed the shape of it, is that he went hunting for a particular beer can. He wanted the right one. It mattered to him that it be correct, because he was the kind of filmmaker for whom the wrong can in the corner of a frame is a lie about America. And while he was looking for it, the sun kept going, the way the sun does. Eastwood looked at the light. Then he ordered the shot taken immediately, without the can and without the director. And then he left. Principal photography had started on the 6th of October, 1975. On the 24th of October, 18 days in, the producer Bob Daly walked over and fired Philip Kaufman. Eastwood did not do it himself. He never does it himself. Imagine that afternoon. Kaufman had been on this thing for months. He had scouted the country himself, driving Arizona and Utah and Northern California, looking at rock formations with the cinematographer, deciding where a man's grief would look right against a horizon. He had done the casting. He had rewritten the book. He had a folder of research about Missouri in 1866 that nobody else on the picture had read. And there were 100 people out there in the dirt who had been calling him boss for 3 weeks, and they all stopped what they were doing to watch a producer walk him away from the camera. And then everybody went back to work. That's the part. The lights did not go off. The picture did not shut down for a week of meetings. A man's life fell over sideways at 2 in the afternoon, and by 4 they were shooting again, because the sun was going. Eastwood took over as director. The picture wrapped on the 6th of December, roughly 8.5 weeks from first day to last, using every bit of the pre-production that Kaufman had spent months building, including the locations Kaufman had scouted and the actors Kaufman had cast. Chief Dan George is in that film, giving one of the great supporting performances in any Western, and Philip Kaufman is the man who hired him. The Outlaw Josey Wales is a masterpiece. That has to be said. It is one of the 4 or 5 best Westerns ever made in this country, and it is Eastwood's first genuinely great film as a director. And there is a real chance it would not have been better with Kaufman, and a real chance it would have been. Nobody will ever know. What everybody knows is what happened next. The Directors Guild of America went off like a grenade. This was the nightmare. Not a director being replaced which happens, but a star firing the director and then giving himself the job. Every director in America looked at that and saw the future. Any actor with a producing credit could now take your movie away from you 18 days in and put his own name on it. The Guild demanded Kaufman be reinstated. Warner Brothers said no. Eastwood said no. The Guild fined him, reportedly around $60,000, which he paid the way you pay a parking ticket. And then the Directors Guild changed the rule book permanently, so it could never happen again. If a director is removed from a picture, the replacement cannot be the star or the producer who removed him. The successor must come from outside. They wrote it because of one man, so they named it after him. They call it the Eastwood Rule. It is still in force. It is in the contracts today. Half a century later, every director in the American film industry works under a protection that exists because Clint Eastwood got tired of waiting for a beer can. Here is the part that will surprise you. He has never once expressed regret, and he has never once attacked Philip Kaufman. His explanation, whenever he has been pressed on it, is almost boringly reasonable. He said it was a difference in point of view. He said he had his own money in the picture and a clear idea of what it was, and he did not want it interpreted by somebody else. That's it. No anger. No claim that Kaufman was incompetent because Kaufman obviously wasn't. Just, it was mine. He was doing something else with it, so he had to go. Kaufman's career survived. He made great films for another 25 years. Nobody in Hollywood held it against him, which is its own quiet verdict on the whole business. And he has spoken about it since with a restraint that suggests a man who understood exactly what he had walked into and decided he did not need to spend his life on it. But there was one more thing about that production, and it is the thing that actually matters, and neither man has ever really talked about it. Philip Kaufman had cast the picture. He had a view about the female lead, a young woman called Laura Lee, who is supposed to be a girl, barely more than a child. Eastwood overruled him and cast a 31-year-old actress from Tennessee. Some of the people who were there thought that the two men had noticed her at the same time, and that jealousy got into the argument alongside everything else. It is impossible to prove, and both men have been silent about it for 50 years. What is not in dispute is that in a motel in Page, Arizona, in the October of that shoot, while a director was being fired 18 days into his own movie, Clint Eastwood began the only relationship of his life that he would not be able to end quietly. Her name was Sandra Locke, and it was going to take him 19 years, 2 lawsuits, a changed lock, and a letter addressed to another man's wife to get her out of the frame. There is one line she gave an interviewer once about being a child in Tennessee, and once you have read it, you cannot read anything else about her the same way. My childhood, she said, felt as if I had been dropped off at an extended summer camp from which I was waiting to be picked up. She was born Sandra Louise Smith in Shelbyville, Tennessee, 60 miles down the road from Nashville, in May of 1944. Her father was a serviceman stationed at a nearby base, and he was gone before she arrived. And she never met him, not once, not ever. Her mother married again, and it didn't take. Then in 1948, a carpenter named Alfred Locke married her mother and gave his last name to somebody else's children and raised them as his own, which is a decent thing that a lot of men in that county did, and which does not fill the hole. Her mother worked in a pencil factory. She was a bright, strange, dreaming girl in a town that had no use for any of those things, and she read constantly, which baffled her mother, who kept telling her to go outside. And the only other person in Shelbyville who understood her was a boy named Gordon Anderson. He was born the same year she was, 3 months later, an Army corporal's son from Arkansas, whose family had washed up in Bedford County. He was clever and theatrical and full of plans, and he was gay in Shelbyville, Tennessee in the 1950s, which meant he was going to spend his life either hiding or leaving. The two of them found each other in high school and never let go. Not romance, something more permanent than that. She said later under oath that he was more like a sister to her, and she said it without a trace of embarrassment, because that was the truth of it. Two misfits in a small town, each holding the other one's hand, while they waited for the world to come and pick them up. He is the one who found the door. In 1966, Warner Brothers announced a nationwide search for a girl to play Mick Kelly in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. From the Carson McCullers novel, Mick is 14, Sandra was 22. Gordon did not blink. He went to work on her like a sculptor, which is what he later became. He bleached her eyebrows. He bound her chest with bandages so it lay flat. He did her hair and her makeup, and put her in a plain little cotton dress, and gave her freckles with a brown pen, and gave her a skinned knee with food coloring and a bandage, and made her sunburnt with fake skin. She looked in the mirror and did not recognize herself. She said so. Staring back at her, she said, was an entirely different person. Then they got in the car and drove to Birmingham, Alabama, and walked into the theater where the auditions were being held. And the room was full of girls who had done exactly the same thing. More than 300 Mick Kellys in one building, 2,000 nationwide. She got it, of course she got it, because Gordon Anderson had spent 10 years studying how to make a person out of nothing, having had to do it to himself. She lied about her age to get the part, and then kept lying about it. At the premiere in 1968, she told the press she was 21. She was 24. The Nashville paper, her own hometown paper, called her out on it immediately, and everybody else believed her for about 30 years. The lie is the most revealing thing about her. She had been waiting her whole life to be picked up, and when they finally came for her, she was already too old for the part. So she took 3 years off and hoped nobody would check. She married Gordon Anderson on the 25th of September, 1967, at the First Presbyterian Church in Nashville, 1 week after the picture started shooting. There was no honeymoon. There was never going to be a honeymoon. They both knew what it was. And it was not a fraud, it was a shelter. In those days, she explained years later, a man and a woman did not live together unless they were married. So they married and stayed married for 51 years and never once consummated it. And each of them had their own life, and neither of them ever left the other. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter came out in the summer of 1968, and she was nominated for an Academy Award for the first thing she ever did. Gordon designed her dress for the ceremony. Aqua sequins, $7,000, and the fashion magazines went mad for it and started calling him for Jane Fonda and Candice Bergen. She lost to Ruth Gordon. She went home, and then nothing happened for years. That is the part nobody understands about her. She was not a starlet who got lucky and blew it. She was a legitimately nominated actress who came out of the gate with something rare, and then found that Hollywood had no earthly idea what to do with a small, pale, watchful woman who looked like a ghost of a child. She did a picture about rats. She did television. She waited again, the way she had waited in Shelbyville. In 1972, a mutual friend named Joe Himes walked her onto the Universal lot to read for a film called Breezy, about an old man and a young girl, which Clint Eastwood was going to direct. She didn't get it. He remembered her anyway. 3 years later, in 1975, they cast her as Laura Lee in The Outlaw Josie Wales, over the objections of the man who was still, for another 2 weeks, the director. She took $18,000 for it. That was a serious pay cut, and she knew it. And she took it anyway, because she had been out in the cold for 7 years, and this was Clint Eastwood. They started in Page, Arizona in October, and by the end of the month they were together, and Philip Kaufman was unemployed. What he told her in Page, according to her, was this: that there was no real relationship left with his wife, that she was the first woman he had ever really loved, and that he was going to be, for the first time in his life, monogamous. He apparently sang her a little song about it. Clint Eastwood, sitting in Arizona, making up a song about monogamy for a woman he had known for 3 weeks. They moved in together that October and stayed for 13 years. 6 films. Josie Wales in 1976, The Gauntlet in 1977, Every Which Way But Loose in 1978, which was a comedy with an orangutan and made an obscene amount of money, Bronco Billy in 1980, which is the best of them, and the one where she is actually allowed to be a person, Any Which Way You Can that same year, and Sudden Impact in 1983, a Dirty Harry picture in which she plays a rape survivor hunting down the men who did it. Look at the shape of those parts. Look at what he kept doing to her on screen. She is threatened, she is shot at. In The Gauntlet, she plays a prostitute being transported to testify. In a bus that is fired on so many thousands of times, it disintegrates around her. She is menaced, chained, brutalized, and rescued, over and over, in film after film by him for 8 years. Susan Sarandon was offered a part in one of his pictures around then, Tightrope, and turned it down. And when she raised the question of all that violence against women in the script, Eastwood, by her account, said something that ought to be carved over the door of the whole industry. He said he didn't think it was his job to worry about that. He said he was an actor. Meanwhile, out in the town, something quieter was happening to her, and it was fatal. Nobody would hire her, not because anybody blacklisted her, because everybody assumed she was Clint's. She was in the Clint business. If you wanted Sandra Locke, you presumably had to go through Malpaso. And who wants that phone call? And anyway, isn't she busy? So the offers stopped coming, and she was working constantly, and she was disappearing. This is the quietest kind of ruin there is. And it happened to a great many women in that town, and almost nobody ever proved it. Because there was nothing to prove. No one did anything. There was no memo. A casting director simply glanced at a name on a list and thought, "Oh, she's with Clint," and moved his finger down one line. And that was the entire event. And it happened maybe 400 times over 8 years in rooms she was never in. She had been nominated for an Academy Award for the first thing she ever filmed. By 1983, she was a woman whose entire body of work in a decade had been made by the man she lived with, and every part of it had been given to her, and none of it had been won. That is not a career, that's an allowance. She had 2 abortions in those years, and a tubal ligation. She described them later in different ways at different times, sometimes as mutual decisions, sometimes as something she went along with. The one thing that is consistent in every version is that at the end of it she could not have children, and she was in her 30s, and she had chosen a man who already had children he did not talk about. Because here is what she did not know. Somewhere around 1984, Clint Eastwood met a flight attendant named Jacelyn Reeves. In 1986, while Sandra Locke was living in his house, Jacelyn Reeves had his son. In 1988, she had his daughter. On both birth certificates, in the space where the father's name goes, somebody wrote that the father declined. Scott Eastwood and Catherine Eastwood grew up as facts nobody was allowed to mention. Locke says she had no idea. There is no reason to disbelieve her, and there is every reason to believe him capable of it, because he had been keeping separate rooms since 1954. Then she wanted to direct. That is what broke it, and both of them essentially agree on that, which is remarkable given that they agree on nothing else. In 1986, she made Ratboy, an $8 million dark comedy, her first film as a director. Malpaso produced it. She asked him not to. She told him, in as many words, that it really would not be in her best interest for him to come on to it. He said he wouldn't put his name on it, and then he put his company on it, which is his name, and then he told her what to do the entire time. Her explanation of what happened is the best 2 sentences anybody has ever written about Clint Eastwood. He was daddy, she said, and I guess that was no longer the case. When you're a director, the job itself forces you to take charge. He didn't want her to direct. She said it plainly. He had been the director, and she had been the actor, and he was the one in charge. And the moment she stood up out of the chair, the arrangement stopped working. That same spring, he was sworn in as mayor of Carmel, and she wasn't there. She told the columnists it was the Ratboy schedule. It wasn't. She was in Tennessee, sitting with her mother-in-law who was dying, Gordon's mother, and she could not tell anyone that, because to explain where she was, she would have had to explain who she was. And she was, legally, Mrs. Gordon Anderson. She missed the biggest day of his public life to sit with the mother of the man she had married in 1967 for shelter, and she had to lie to the newspapers about it. And 3 years later, he would use that marriage certificate to try to prove she had never really been his. The end came in stages, the way it does. On the 29th of December, 1988, at their place in Sun Valley, Idaho, there was a screaming match. Not his screaming, hers mostly at a wall of nothing. At the end of it, he suggested she go back to Los Angeles. She went, and then she barely saw him for months, and people they had known for a decade stopped returning her calls, which is how Hollywood tells you a thing before anyone says it. "In my head," she said afterward, "I guess I knew it was over, but in my heart Clint and I were still not severed." They made one last public appearance together in January of 1989, and on the 10th of April, 1989, while Sandra Locke was on a soundstage directing a difficult sequence for a police picture called Impulse, doing the job she had wanted her whole life, Clint Eastwood had the locks changed on the house in Bel Air. He had her possessions boxed and put into storage, and a letter was delivered telling her not to come home. It was not sent to her at the studio. It was not handed to her by a lawyer. It was delivered to Gordon Anderson's doorstep, and it was addressed to Mrs. Gordon Anderson. Read that one more time, because it is the coldest thing in this entire story, and it was done by a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of never raising his voice. He did not throw her out. He simply established in writing on the day he ended it that she had always been somebody else's wife. That letter was the legal defense. He filed it before there was a case. She sued for $70 million, and in the depositions his position was that she had been, essentially, a roommate, a part-time roommate, 13 years, 6 films, 2 abortions, 1 house, and the word he chose was roommate. He also acknowledged that he had tapped a telephone, which he explained as a matter of concern about a stalker. The case ran about 19 months. During it, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. They settled in 1990, and the settlement is the most Clint Eastwood object ever constructed. She got a house, she got $450,000, and she got a 3-year development and directing deal at Warner Brothers worth $1.5 million, arranged quietly through him. She dropped the suit and went to work, and then she took Warner Brothers about 30 projects over 3 years, and Warner Brothers said no to every single one of them. Every one. She brought them one with Arnold Schwarzenegger attached to it, at a moment when Arnold Schwarzenegger was the biggest movie star in the world, and they said no to that too. Not one film. 3 years in office, a phone, a parking space, and not one film. Then she found out where the money had come from. The deal was not Warner Brothers' deal. According to her, Clint Eastwood was funding it himself, quietly from behind, and the studio had no obligation to make anything, and never intended to. She had been given an office to sit in for 3 years so that a lawsuit would go away. She sued him again in 1995 for fraud. That trial went badly for him. By the reports at the time, the jury was running 10-2 in her favor when the two sides settled out of court. In 1996, for a number nobody has ever published, she settled with Warner Brothers separately in 1999. She wrote a memoir. She titled it The Good, the Bad, and the Very Ugly, which is a very good joke and a very bad idea. And in it she called him a completely evil, manipulating, lying excuse for a man. He answered once, and only once in the way he always answers. He called her a professional victim. Then he stopped talking about her, and he never started again. She lived another 22 years. She directed a few things. She did some television. She stayed married to Gordon Anderson right to the end, and he was there. And he was the one who reported it when she died at her home in Los Angeles on the 3rd of November, 2018, of cardiac arrest, with the breast cancer she had gotten during the first lawsuit in her bones by then. She was 74. She left him everything, about $20 million, which is what the fight had eventually been worth. Nobody noticed for 6 weeks. Her death was not reported until a tabloid found the certificate in the middle of December, more than a month after she was gone. One of the most famous women in America in 1980, dead in her house in Los Angeles for 6 weeks before the news got out. Clint Eastwood said nothing, not a statement, not a line to a reporter, not one word in 2018 or since. He has praised Sergio Leone. He has praised Don Siegel. He called Gene Hackman a dear friend when Hackman died. He has said that he adored Gene Seberg. The man is not incapable of tenderness about the dead, about the woman he lived with for 13 years and put in 6 pictures. There has been for 8 years now nothing at all. And that is the difference. Every other name on this list got closed the same way, quietly, without heat. The way you shut a door in a house where somebody is sleeping. By Berman never knew, Marvin never knew, Mac Lane was never told, Leone was thanked. Sandra Locke is the only person Clint Eastwood ever had to lock out, because she was the only one who had a key. The girl who spent her whole childhood waiting to be picked up got picked up at 31 by the most famous man in the world. And 13 years later, she came back from work, and her key didn't fit. And there was a letter at her friend's house, addressed to a name she had only ever used as a place to hide. He was 58 when he changed those locks. He had another 35 years of work in front of him, and he did all of it without ever explaining a single thing to anybody. And the list kept getting names, and the names kept never being told. Which brings us back to the thought we left in 2011. In February of that year, in downtown Los Angeles, an 80-year-old man started a 39-day shoot on a $35 million picture about the most feared bureaucrat in American history. Nobody has ever suggested that Clint Eastwood made J. Edgar because of Jean Seber. There is no evidence for it. He has never mentioned her name in connection with it, and the script came to him from other people. And if you put the idea to him, he would almost certainly look at you the way he looks at everybody and say nothing at all. But it is still true that 41 years after a girl from Iowa read a lie in a magazine and went into labor, Clint Eastwood spent 2 hours of screen time inside the head of the man who ordered the lie writ. And it is still true that at one point in that film, J. Edgar Hoover turns and asks a question out loud. And the question is, do I kill everything that I love? Leonardo DiCaprio says the line, and DiCaprio is the last name on the list. He was 36 that winter, and he had spent his entire adult life being underestimated on the strength of his face, which is a thing he had in common with more people in this story than he probably realizes. He was nominated for an Academy Award at 19 for playing a disabled boy in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and everybody said what a talent. Then Titanic happened, and for about a decade nobody in the world could see past the haircut, and he had to claw his way back to being taken seriously one Scorsese's picture at a time. The way he clawed it back was preparation. That is his whole religion. He researches until there is nothing left to research. He does the accent for months. He eats the raw liver. He walks the corridors where the man actually walked. For Hoover, he went to Washington and stood where Hoover had stood. He sat in the makeup chair for hours every single day, in fake teeth and a nose stretcher, and a skull cap and layers of old-age appliance. And he took less money on the picture so that they would not do it with computers, because he wanted the weight of it on his actual face. Then he arrived on the set of a man who does not rehearse. Judi Dench was there too, playing Hoover's mother, and she was 76 and had never worked with Eastwood, and she has told the story of getting the call. When he rang me up, she said, my voice went up several octaves. She said she had waited 75 years for this. She was his first choice and she was thrilled. And then she sat down on the set next to Leonardo DiCaprio to run the lines, in that comfortable way actors do before the machine starts. And they chatted, and she looked up eventually and asked whether they were going to do the scene. He's done it, DiCaprio told her. It had happened around them. There was no action. There was no clapper in their faces. There was a quiet man near the camera who had already said something like, "In your own time." And the take was over, and it was in the film, and they had been in it without being informed. Armie Hammer got the same treatment. He was walking through a rehearsal, holding his script in his hand, actually holding the pages, and Eastwood filmed it. Hammer pointed out that the script was in the shot. Eastwood said he would cut around it and no, there would not be another one. And then, somewhere in those 39 days, Leonardo DiCaprio asked for another take, and Clint Eastwood called the day. Not another take, not a discussion. He rapped, 80 years old, the most decorated director in the room, and his response to the best prepared actor of his generation, asking for one more go, was to end the workday and send 400 people home. Now here is where the internet will lie to you, and where this story has to be honest, because you have been promised the truth and not a rumor. Leonardo DiCaprio has never publicly said a bad word about Clint Eastwood. Not one. Go and look for it. The famous story about how DiCaprio refuses to work with him comes almost entirely from other people, from Judi Dench's anecdote and from Armie Hammer's, and from people watching the set go cold that afternoon and drawing the obvious conclusion. What DiCaprio himself actually said about the experience is this: With Clint, you prepare. You do an incredible amount of research, and it's like getting ready for a stage production because you move at an unbelievably fast pace, and it keeps you on your toes. And then he said, you get this instant adrenaline rush. That is not a complaint, that is close to a compliment. And yet, J. Edgar came out in 2011. It is 15 years later. Leonardo DiCaprio has made a great many films since then, and Clint Eastwood made 9 more. And the two of them have never been in a room together again. That is the whole thesis, standing there in the open at last. There is no quote. There has never been a quote. There is only the absence, and the absence is real, and the absence is the reveal. Matt Damon found the edge of it 2 years earlier on Invictus. He was doing a South African accent, and he was not sure he had it. And after the first take, Eastwood said, "Cut, print, check the gate," and started to move on. Damon reasonably asked for another. Why? Eastwood said, "Do you want to waste everybody's time?" Damon has told that story a dozen times, and he always tells it the same way, half terrified and half in love. And he came back. He made another film with Eastwood the very next year. He adjusted. Tom Hanks came off Sully and gave the best description anybody has managed in 60 years. "He treats us like horses," Hanks said. He said Eastwood does not shout action. He says quietly, "All right, go ahead." He does not shout cut. He says that's enough of that. And Hanks, an Academy Award winner twice over, said the thing that ought to end the argument. He said it was intimidating as hell. And Hanks was right about the horses, and he knew exactly why. Because it goes back to Rawhide. It goes back to a boy of 28, standing in the dust in 1959, with 600 steers in the frame, learning that if you raise your voice on this set, everything you have built will run. 50 years later, Laura Linney would come off a picture with him and explain what it does to a person. "We all have nervous systems," she said. "When someone screams action, it takes a little time to recover." Angelina Jolie was frankly terrified of the one-take reputation before Changeling, and came out the other side saying it kept everything fresh, that you don't get time to overthink, that you stay real. Morgan Freeman has said flatly that Eastwood doesn't fool around with actors, that he hires the right person and then leaves them alone, and that everybody comes off his set thinking he is the best director they ever had. Freeman also carried away a line from him that he has repeated ever since, 4 words that are the closest thing to a philosophy the man has ever offered. "Don't let the old man in." That is the whole paradox, and it is not a paradox at all. The quiet is a kindness. The quiet is also the blade. It comes from the same place, from the herd, from the understanding that a nervous animal does its best work when nobody frightens it, and that a nervous animal will also cost you the afternoon if you handle it wrong. He is gentle with actors for the same reason he is merciless with them, because the day is the thing. And that finally is what the list is. Go back through it, every name. Abner by Berman cost him 2 minutes and a dignity, and got crossed off with a pencil. Lee Marvin cost him months on a mountain. Sergio Leone wanted a day for a shot of a man's eyes. Shirley MacLaine wanted a reason for a scene, and the reason cost a morning. Philip Kaufman wanted the right beer can, and the sun was going. Michael Cimino wanted the cloud to be perfect, and it eventually cost him a studio. Leonardo DiCaprio wanted one more take. Every single one of them was asking for the same thing. They were asking for more time. And there is only one thing Clint Eastwood has ever been afraid of in 96 years. And it isn't death, and it isn't failure, and it isn't loneliness. It's the afternoon going by with nothing in it. He learned that at 21, in black water off Point Reyes, with 2 miles to swim and lights on a shore. Don't thrash, don't look at the cold, don't look at the distance. Pick the light and go. And if a thing is not helping you get to shore, let it go and do not turn around. He has been swimming that 2 miles ever since. Everybody on the list is something he let go of in the water, and you cannot separate the gift from the damage, which is the thing about him that nobody has ever managed to resolve, least of all the people who worked for him and came away loving him and never got asked back. The same instinct that let a 21-year-old private survive the Pacific by refusing to look at anything except a light on a shore is the instinct that produced 40 films in 50 years, while other men were still arguing about the clouds. And it is also the instinct that let him look at a woman he had lived with for 13 years and calculate, quite calmly, that she was now something he was carrying rather than something helping him get to shore. You do not get one without the other. There is no version of Clint Eastwood who makes Unforgiven and also returns the phone call. The economy is the man, and the man is the economy, and everybody who ever stood in front of his camera got the benefit of it, and a few of them got the bill, everybody except one, because there is a name that does not fit. There is one man Clint Eastwood chased, for years past all reason, past every instinct he had, and the whole thing falls into place the second you see it. John Wayne was born in Iowa in 1907 and became the most famous American who ever lived. He had come up carrying props at Fox, and John Ford had made him, and by the 1960s he was not a movie star, he was a position. He stood for something, and the something was clear, and it did not have shades in it. The good men were good, the West was worth taking, and the hero did not shoot first. Then Clint Eastwood came home from Spain with a poncho and a cigar, and a man who shot everybody. In 1973, Eastwood directed his first Western, High Plains Drifter. It is about a stranger who rides into a town that has done something unforgivable and who makes the townspeople paint every building red and rename the place hell, and then lets it burn. 3 people are dead, and a woman has been assaulted within the first 10 minutes. It is a ghost story and a judgment, and it is not remotely about pioneers. John Wayne watched it and sat down and wrote Clint Eastwood a letter. Eastwood described that letter years later to Kenneth Turan of the Los Angeles Times, and his description is one of the few times in his life he has sounded genuinely sad about anything. John Wayne once wrote me a letter, he said, saying he didn't like High Plains Drifter. He said it wasn't really about the people who pioneered the West. And then Eastwood said this, I realized that there's 2 different generations, and he wouldn't understand what I was doing. High Plains Drifter was meant to be a fable. It wasn't meant to show the hours of pioneering drudgery. It wasn't supposed to be anything about settling the West. He didn't write back, he never wrote back, but he did not cross the name off, because around that same time, a writer named Larry Cohen, with Bob Barbesh, had a script called The Hostiles. A young gambler wins half of an older man's estate in a card game, and the 2 of them are stuck with each other, and they hate each other, and they have to hold the place together against men who want to take it. Eastwood would be the gambler, Wayne would be the old man. It was the whole argument of American movies in one picture. The 2 generations forced to share a house, and every person who has ever heard the pitch has had the same reaction, which is, my God, imagine it. Eastwood optioned it. He thought the script needed work, and he said so, and he did not care, because he could see it. He sent it to John Wayne. Wayne said no. Eastwood revised it and sent it again. That is the second time. Understand what that is. This is a man who fired a director on the 18th day, who crossed a name off a list because he didn't like a face, who has never in his life asked twice for anything. He asked John Wayne twice, and Wayne answered that time with the letter. Later, Wayne's son Michael, who was a producer, got hold of the script and thought he'd try one more time and brought it to his father on a boat. Wayne took one look at the cover page. This piece of shit again, he said, and threw it in the water. He is reported to have gone on from there, and the tirade is worth hearing because there is a frightened man inside it. This kind of stuff, he said, is all they know how to write these days. The sheriff is the heavy. The townspeople are a bunch of jerks. Someone like me and Eastwood ride into town, know everything, act the big guys, and everyone else is a bunch of idiots. He wasn't wrong about the script, necessarily. He was wrong about what was being offered to him. He had been offered a way out of being a monument, and he threw it in the ocean. And it is very hard to blame a man for that, because being a monument was the only job he had left, and he was already sick. Look at it from his deck for a second. He is in his 60s. He has 1 lung. He is having trouble getting on a horse, and everybody can see it, and nobody says it. Every year the movies get uglier, and every year the men who make them get younger, and they keep telling him that the country he spent 40 years playing was a lie. And here is the boy who did more than anybody to make that argument. This television cowboy who went to Italy and came back and took the whole thing apart with a cigar in his mouth. And now the boy is sending him scripts, twice. You can call that ego. It probably was. It was also a man being asked to sign his own eviction notice, and asked politely by the person moving in. He said no. It was the only thing he had left to say. Now, here is the sentence that unlocks Clint Eastwood, and it does not come from Clint Eastwood. It comes from Larry Cohen, the man who wrote The Thing, still grieving over it decades later. Cohen said it was one of the greatest disappointments of his career, and then he explained why it died. He said, "We already had Clint, and suppose he didn't do the picture with John Wayne. What if he did it with George C. Scott, or Burt Lancaster, or some other big actor? It could have still been great." But Cohen said, Clint did not want to do the Hostiles with anyone else except John Wayne. There it is. The man who deletes people would not replace one. He had George C. Scott available. He had Burt Lancaster available. He had a script he owned and a co-star's chair, and the biggest opening in the world. And he could have cast any man alive in that part. And he shut the picture down instead. He wanted Wayne or he wanted nothing. And he got nothing. The one name Clint Eastwood would not cross off is the one name that crossed him off. They did meet once properly. In 1976, John Wayne made his last film, The Shootist, about a gunfighter dying of cancer, which he was. It was directed by Don Siegel and photographed by Bruce Surtees. Read that again. John Wayne's goodbye to the movies was made by Clint Eastwood's mentor and Clint Eastwood's cameraman. Eastwood came to the set. He visited. They were polite to each other, two enormous men being careful. And Wayne was thin by then and had less than 3 years left. Whatever either of them thought, neither of them said it. Wayne died in the summer of 1979, 72 years old. And 13 years after that, Clint Eastwood made Unforgiven. It is about an old killer who cannot get on his horse anymore. It is about how the legends are lies told by drunks, and how shooting a man takes away everything he has, and everything he is ever going to have. It is the film that finally says out loud that everything John Wayne stood for was a story people told themselves. He dedicated it to Sergio and Don. He was 62 years old, and he won Best Picture and Best Director. And the Academy, that had never once said his name for acting in 30 years, finally called him up for taking the whole thing apart. He would do it again 12 years later with $1 Million Baby, which is also about an old man and a young person, and how you cannot save anybody. There was nobody left to argue with him about it. That is the part nobody says. He won the argument because the other man was in the ground. So we come back to the room, a soundstage somewhere at any point in the last 50 years. It is very quiet. There are no shouted commands, and there is no man in a canvas chair with a megaphone. There is only a tall figure standing near the camera with his hands in his pockets. And when he has what he needs, he says, in a voice you have to lean in to hear, "That's enough of that." That's how the takes ended. That's how the days ended. And that, it turns out, is how the people ended too. He is 96 now. He lives in Carmel, in the town he picked out for himself, when he was a broke private at Fort Ord with nothing in his pockets, and he was its mayor once. And he has outlived very nearly every person in this story. By Berman went in 1977, Wayne in 1979. Fleming went into a river in Peru in 1966 and left everything to his mother. Marvin Leone, Siegel, Seberg, Semino, Locke, Hackman, all gone. His last film was Juror Number 2 in 2024, his 40th as a director, and Warner Brothers barely put it in theaters, and he did not attend the premiere. The studio he made billions of dollars forgave his 40th picture a shrug. After 65 years of quietly crossing names off lists, somebody quietly crossed off his. The woman he had lived with for 10 years, Christina Sandera, died in the summer of 2024. He said almost nothing. In 2025, a European newspaper published an interview with him that he had never given, full of quotes he had never said. And the 95-year-old man picked up the telephone and called a trade paper to set the record straight. And what he corrected out of everything was the arithmetic. He said he could confirm that he had turned 95. He said he could also confirm the interview was entirely phony. And that was the whole statement. He never announced that he was finished. Of course he didn't. He has never announced anything in his life. The news came sideways. In an interview his son Kyle gave in France, mentioning almost in passing that his father was retired now. He didn't say cut, he just didn't come back. So here is the truth about the list. And it is not the truth you were promised. And it is better. It was never a list of people Clint Eastwood hated. There is no evidence he ever hated anybody. It was a list of people who asked him for more time. And time was the only currency he ever believed in. And he had learned the exchange rate at 21, in cold water in the dark, with lights on a shore 2 miles off, and no one coming. Pick the light, don't thrash. Don't look back at what you dropped. It made him one of the greatest filmmakers this country ever produced. It also meant that a man could wave him away at an audition and be dead for 50 years without ever knowing he'd been sentenced. It meant a woman could come home from work and find her key didn't fit. It meant a girl from Iowa could come down off a mountain in Oregon and discover she had been switched off like a lamp. And now he has all the time in the world, in a house in Carmel at 96, retired, with almost everyone he ever refused already dead. There is only one name he ever wanted to keep. He asked for it twice, which he has never done for anybody, and the answer came back in a letter he did not reply to, and then it came back again as a script floating in the Pacific. He could have made the Hostels with anyone. He made it with nobody. That's the thing about a man who knows exactly when a scene is finished. He is almost always right. He was right about By Berman, and right about Paint Your Wagon, and right about Kaufman, and right about the take, and right about the day, and right about the light going. He was wrong